When
yeah. So basically what I would like to do is just to review the current knowledge about vulnerabilities. And this is in police interviews. When we talk about vulnerabilities, it's a very broad term. It could be vulnerable to giving false confessions. It could be vulnerable to being coerced into crime or manipulated, or it can be vulnerable to sexual exploitation. I am focusing on police interviews to make it a bit more narrow, because I can't focus on vulnerabilities in every context. So this is really what I'm doing. So I will be really looking at the kind of key vulnerabilities and the key challenges that are related to actually people interviewed at police stations and giving their statements. And I will then be demonstrating by cases about how this actually works and how multifaceted this really is. If you take the next slide, Introduction to 40 Years of Science and Practice, just tell me you got that slide.
Yeah, that's up now.
Now, that book basically summarizes 40 years of science and practice. And I'm a forensic clinical psychologist. I am a practitioner and an academic combined. The work that I've done in relation to vulnerabilities and police interviews have been driven by cases. And that's how it all started. And the cases stimulated my research interest. And I did research to test hypotheses and to develop instruments. And then these became used as an empirical database and could also be used in the assessment of people. So if you move on to the next slide, broad description of vulnerability. Basically, I view vulnerability as any factor that impairs the capacity of the person to understand his or her legal rights. It's very important that people understand their legal rights at the police station and that they understand the purpose of the interview. That's terribly important. That they understand the questions they're asked and the consequences and the implications of their answers. And then people have to be able to communicate appropriately, relative material, and reliably and effectively. So communication is terribly important. And if you move on to the next slide, it actually relates to codes of practice about vulnerabilities of adults. Vulnerabilities at police stations, this is from the Codes of Practice 2019. Obviously, any person below the age of 18 is considered vulnerable and is automatically entitled to an appropriate adult. In the codes of practice that are on your slide, we are talking about people who are vulnerable because of some mental health condition or mental disorder. And they may have difficulty understanding and communicating effectively, as we've discussed. And there's no need to read this, but this is basically about people at police stations. So move on to this next slide, slide 2. And basic vulnerability does not, if the person does not appear to understand the significance of what they're saying or what they're told, etc., or they appear to be prone to becoming confused and providing unreliable, misleading, and incriminating information. And what is terribly important about the new codes of practice is that they refer to suggestibility. They actually mention if person is accepting or acting on suggestions from others without consciously knowing or wishing to do so, or they are agreeing the suggestions that are put to them without protest. So it's basically focusing on vulnerabilities, being able to understand what's going on, being able to communicate, not being unduly suggestible during the interview, and then being able to cope with the interrogative pressure in a police interview. So I do think this is actually quite solid now in the codes of practice, which I think is good. Of course, we can always criticize the codes of practice. They could always be better, but they are improving. Next one, next slide, notes for guidance regarding vulnerability. And this is basically from the codes of practice, given the page number. So if people want to look it up, they can on the internet. But what we're talking about is the importance of circumstances. People are vulnerable in particular circumstances. Circumstances matter. And also in this, on this slide, we talk about people who are prone or have risk, are at risk of giving unreliable evidence, and the importance of corroborating their evidence. It's important to corroborate what they're actually saying. So the codes of practice, basically, you have to look at the circumstances where they become vulnerable, and you have to then corroborate what they actually say. So these are two important components. If you look at the next slide, that relates to the threshold for calling an appropriate adult. And if at any time an officer has a reason to suspect that a person of any age may be vulnerable, and this is in the absence of any clear evidence to the contrary. So if the officer suspects the person is vulnerable, that has to be acted on. So I think that's terribly important. Now, what is a risk factor? And that's the next slide.
Okay.
So next slide. And a risk factor is any factor that increases the likelihood of a particular outcome. For instance, if somebody is vulnerable and they're likely to give unreliable statement or a false confession. Vulnerability, when relevant and salient, become risk factors. So vulnerabilities in a police interview, if they're relevant and actually they had to be salient, then they become actually risk factors within the context of the police interview. And I've identified in my book that I showed you earlier, a list of 17 sets of potential risk factors to false confessions. So I've actually listed all these risk factors that are linked to vulnerabilities. Now, next slide, please.
Yeah.
If you looked at key factors, risk factors to false confessions, age. There's a lot of research to show that people who are young, the younger they are during the police interview, the more vulnerable they are to giving false confessions. And that's why, of course, in the codes of practice, if people are 17 or younger, they're entitled to have an appropriate adult. Now, we have to look at context, and context is terribly important. Context and circumstances. The context may be that there is a lot of pressure on the police to solve the case. And if the police are under a lot of pressure to solve the case, they may put people under pressure and they may have shortcuts to get a confession because that's a quick way of solving a case. So in actual fact, we have to look at the pressure on the police and the context, and also the circumstances. Are they being interviewed in relation to the death of somebody they were close to? Is there bereavement? Did they know the person, the victim, for instance, that may relate to vulnerability? So it's important that we look at context and circumstances. And then we have to look at interrogation and custodial pressures. How long is the person being kept in custody? What are the conditions in custody? How is the person being interviewed? Does he have a lawyer, an appropriate adult? Or is the person interviewed, you know, for a long period of time or a short period of time? You know, if they're interviewed for 2 hours, that's a good guidance. So the length of the interview and the techniques that are used become important, but also the pressure of being in custody also, because what typically happens in my experience is that people in police custody are thinking in the short term. They're thinking about, how can I get out of the police station? How can I stop the interrogation? And they may not be thinking about the long-term consequences. And then we look at, in actual fact, they have to understand the police caution. And that's terribly important, that they actually understand the police caution. Now, the mindset of the suspect is important. If the person enters the interrogation being very suspicious of the police and hostile, he's unlikely to be giving anything. Or if the person enters the interview believing that if you're innocent, you don't need a lawyer, that is a mindset that's not terribly healthy. And the mindset of many people that I have evaluated, and I evaluated over 500 individuals in major cases who are being interviewed in police custody and have disputed their confessions. And typically, they think my solicitor can sort it out. That's the mindset. All I have to do is to get out of the police station and my lawyer can sort it out. That's very, very common. So if people are really innocent, it may put them at risk. And there is research evidence to show that innocence in itself can be a risk factor, because it makes people think they don't need the lawyer and they have got nothing to hide, which they haven't. Then number 6 on the slide, you've got physical and mental health problems. And these are durable factors that they come, that's the part of the history. And then obviously you have current factors, you have mental state, how the person is actually functioning, the state of the individual concerned. And then you have absence of support or the presence of support. And you have to feature that in, whether people have support. And if they do have support, whether they actually are being provided with satisfactory support, because you can have a lawyer, like in the Carter 3, who doesn't do anything constructive when his client is being shouted at. So people have to be proactive. The appropriate adult has to work effectively. The lawyer has to be effective. And then we move on to the next slide of risk factors.
Yeah.
If people are on prescribed medication, not having their medication may leave them vulnerable, because if they have a heart condition and they don't have their tablets, they may become terribly anxious. Withdrawal symptoms from alcohol and drugs, impaired mental state factors, developmental disorders such as autism, learning disabilities, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And then you have personality factors, and the 2 main ones are suggestibility and compliance. But there are other personality factors that may be relevant in a given case. Next slide, challenges at the police station.
Yeah.
What is important is that the police properly identify people who are vulnerable, so they can be provided with the necessary care. That means they're provided with an appropriate adult, but also that the police takes into consideration their vulnerabilities and therefore interviews them more carefully and cautiously. And there could be self-identification, and mental health professionals are more at police stations, but it's not just about physical health, it's about mental health. And nurses at the police station often focus on risk and physical factors, whereas they should be considering also psychological factors, mental health factors that may impact on the person's ability to cope with the police interview. And then obviously providing an appropriate adult when required, and ensuring the quality of that person. Parents are not always very good as appropriate adults, because they may have conditions themselves. If you have someone with autism or developmental disorders or ADHD, these are highly heritable conditions. So in actual fact, the family members may have the same or the similar conditions or vulnerabilities themselves, or that they may not understand, that what the interview is all about. So it's important to have the quality of the appropriate adult. Of course, there are parents who are very good appropriate adults, but they tend to be more vulnerable than trained appropriate adults, because obviously if you're a trained appropriate adult, you know more about exactly what you should be doing. And now the next slide, key challenges, retrospective analysis. Now, when psychologists and psychiatrists are asked to do reports on somebody who has given a confession that they claim to be false, this is often weeks, months, and sometimes years, and sometimes many years after the confession is made. Then it becomes very challenging to evaluate the confession, because you are assessing people whose mental condition may have been very different at the time of the police interview. So you are doing a retrospective analysis of what actually took place, and that has certain limitations. In my experience, I want to look, in my practice, I want to look at everything that's relevant to the police interview. I want to look at the custody records, the tapes of the interviews, not just listen to the read the transcripts, listen to the tapes, and watch if there are videos. So it's very important to review those statements. And it's also desirable to have the records of any psychological or psychiatric reports that are available, or school reports. These can be very important to actually understand the vulnerabilities of the individuals that's being interviewed. The most challenging part of all is basically when you've got vulnerabilities, you've got to look at that. Are these vulnerabilities relevant? What is their weight? How salient are these? And it's actually looking at different vulnerabilities, making sure they're actually relevant, and then putting them in the context of the totality of evidence to determine the potential risk to the reliability of the statements. And that is always the most challenging part. It is very easy for a clinical psychologist to conduct an IQ test on somebody or test someone's suggestibility. But sometimes people test suggestibility when suggestibility isn't relevant. So you always have to look at, and that's why I like to look at the police interview and listen to the tapes and watch the video before I do the assessment, because I want to understand the likely frame of mind and the critical components of the interview process before I do the psychological evaluation, because then I'm better informed to interview the person. And so it is really the propensity to act in a particular way and interpreting the findings that's very, very important. You also have to avoid confirmation bias. When I evaluate cases, I have no predetermined views of guilt or innocence. What I'm looking at are vulnerabilities or potential risk factors. I'm not looking at, did they do it or didn't they do it? Is it a false confession, not false confession? Generally, that is for the court to decide, not for the expert to decide. So if once you decide the person I think is guilty or innocent, it contaminates the evaluation. So I like to go in and say, what does the evidence from the police interviews tell me? What does the psychological evaluation tell me? What does the empirical database that is relevant to this particular assessment tell me, and so forth? So then moving on briefly to a false confession of a normal man. Now, this is important because it used to be thought that only people with mental disorders were likely to make false confessions. In fact, the great majority of all false confessions are made by people who are pretty normal, who haven't got specific mental health issues. They've got vulnerabilities at the time that may have been triggered by the circumstances or manipulated by the police or for some other reasons. So this man was one of the early cases I saw in the 1980s who had confessed to 2 murders. And there was a pre-trial psychiatric and psychological assessment that showed no evidence of mental illness and he was average intelligence, but he was abnormally suggestible on my scale. And if you now look at the next slide, that actually shows a graph of his vulnerabilities. Have you got that? Yeah.
Yeah.
A vulnerability, false confessions of a normal youth to 2 murders and sexual assault. You got that slide. Now we look at the vulnerabilities this person has, who was mentally healthy. He was sensitive about his sexuality. The police had found pornographic magazines in his room, and he was only 17, and they used it to manipulate his sensitivities about his own sexuality. And these were sexual murders. So they manipulated his own sexuality, which made him vulnerable. And he was suggestible, and he was rather timid and unassertive. And the police manipulated him into giving a confession that was contemporaneously recorded in accordance with pace, but it was a false confession. It was shown to be a false confession, proven to be a false confession. Then you look at the pressure he was under. His denials were not accepted. There was immense pressure in manipulation. He is motivated basically to stop the interview and go home and made a false confession. So this is a real case. Then you got the next slide. England's leading case of coercive interviewing, the Cardiff 3. And probably many of you have heard of this case because it's a very well-known case of somebody, Stephen Miller, who confessed to killing a prostitute in Wales who had been stabbed more than 50 times at her home. And there were 5 men arrested after 10 months and 3 were convicted. And Stephen Miller was interrogated on 19 occasions, 13 hours of tapes. And I listened to all these tapes. And I gave evidence at the time, not at first trial, because the judge wouldn't allow me to give evidence at the first trial. The second trial, because the first judge died basically before the summing up. And then there was a new trial, another 6 months. And I was allowed to testify before the judge during a voir dire and also during the trial. That was a challenge cross-examination because the science was young. Suggestibility and compliance were new concepts. The court didn't want to accept it. And they were picking out bits and pieces when Stephen Miller was angry and not accepting all the suggestions. And in actual fact, the prosecutor, and it was reiterated by the judge, referred to my evidence, me being really coming from cloud cuckoo land, which was a bit of an insult. As it turned out, I wasn't, because it was shown subsequently, his conviction was overturned, and then many years later, someone else was caught through DNA. So at the time, the challenge was to demonstrate the science. The psychological evaluation had merit. I did not come from cloud cuckoo land, as they were claiming. But that was those were the early days when, in actual fact, anything was used to try to challenge the psychological evidence. And the early days, there was hostility towards psychology, and it was tough. Nowadays, giving evidence is a lot easier. Having said that, when you go abroad, it can be very tough. And in America, for instance, where I testified in cases, you know, it can be a heavy cross-examination and very lengthy. Now, and you can see next slide of Stephen Miller's vulnerabilities, which were well documented. Borderline IQ, low self-esteem, abnormally suggestible and compliant. In fact, he was persuaded he had committed a crime of which he was completely innocent. And the tapes were horrendous. They were bullying, they were aggressive, they were shouting, shouting at him that he was a liar over 300 times. These were heavy interrogation techniques. If it hadn't been for tape recording, I doubt if the convictions would ever have been overturned, because the tapes showed very clearly the tone and the nature of the interrogation. It became very important. And you can see that there were long interviews. Lawyer was passive. He wanted to give the police what they wanted to hear, and he wanted to stop the interview. He became confused, couldn't cope, and made a false confession. The next case from Norway. This was another tough case and an unusual one, because it's a murder in Norway of a woman from 1995. And 2 years later, her cousin was interrogated for over 170 hours and confessed. And the case was appealed, and I was asked as a court-appointed expert to give evidence, because the psychiatrist who had profiled him and assisted the police to get the confession, he became an expert witness as well. So there were both of us giving evidence, and me looking at the confession. I was asked by the court, and this is the only time when I have been asked to decide if the confession was true or false. And I said, I think that was for the court to decide. But the court said, no, we want you to tell us if this confession is true or false. And I said, I may not be able to do that. But once I'd done all the assessment, I was confident on psychological grounds that the confession was false. And the psychiatrist testified that it was a true confession. And the man was acquitted. And it changed police interviewing in Norway. It changed the criminal justice system in Norway, this one case. And then DNA evidence proved that this man was innocent. And you look at the next slide, you can see me. This is demonstrated by a newspaper article, me arguing it's false. And the psychiatrist saying it's active, which means it's true. This was not a tough case from a psychological perspective, but it was tough because the judges were not on the side of justice. I believe, they were believing in the guilt of the man, and basically, I think they said so, because at the time, they did not want to believe that anybody made a false confession like that in Norway. So sometimes these cases take a lot of work. I often, like in this case, 13 hours. I testified on cases on death row in America and helped to stop 3 executions in the USA. It's always tough. There are always challenges, and you have to overcome these challenges, whatever they are. And if you look at the slide now of the Norwegian case, you can see he was extremely bright, high intelligence, but he had vulnerabilities. He had a history as a juvenile in school of indecent exposure. And it was like a game to him, but it left him vulnerable. It left him with something that the police used to manipulate him. He lacked confidence in his memory, even though his memory was excellent. And he tended to confabulate. He was very good and imaginative, and that was his downfall. He was too imaginative, and the police presented him with scenarios during long interrogation and social isolation and manipulation. He wanted to prove his innocence, but eventually got himself convicted. He wanted to assist the police. So often what I've seen is that people are too keen in custody to assist the police. And if you're innocent, you can assist the police, but you don't assist the police by giving a false confession or implicating someone else. And this person has basically distrusted his memory, began to believe that he had actually done it and pleaded guilty to it, and then believed it for many months that he was a killer, but he wasn't. And when I came along, he really did not have much hope, but the case was fought hard and was won. And these cases, they impact on other cases. They give knowledge. So cases are gold dust. You know, they can change criminal justice systems. If you look at the next slide, the Reykjavik confessions, these are very close to my heart, and these were the most challenging cases of all. The Reykjavik confessions, they got to me because I was in the police at the time that these cases were investigated in 1976. I was a police officer. I was on the periphery of these cases. I knew the interrogators. I knew the prosecutor. I knew the judges. I respected these people. Some of these people were my friends. And then 6 people were wrongfully convicted in relation to 2 murders that probably didn't take place in the first place. And there were 2 particularly vulnerable people. You can see the girl on the left of the slide, Erla Bolladóttir, who is used by the police to implicate the others. And she was convicted of perjury. And now I became involved in the case in 2013 after some diaries emerged from one of the persons who was convicted, showing what had been taking place during the police interrogations. And he had died. He was dead by that time, but the diary survived. And a journalist from Iceland came in 2011 to show me the diaries, and the daughter of the man brought the diaries, and she was present. I then went on television to say that basically, in my view, these cases need to be reinvestigated. Within days, the Minister of the Interior contacted me and asked me to be an expert witness on a committee that was being set up, a working group. The problem was there was a conflict of interest in the sense that I'd been there at the time. And I said, I'll take on the case as long as everybody is happy that I have no conflict of interest. But I worked on the case with an open mind, and the more I got involved in the cases of these 2 people who disappeared in 1974, and 6 people were convicted and sent to prison, the more I looked at the cases, the more concerned I became, and realized these confessions were fundamentally flawed, and that the people I had respected and who had been my friends had used tactics and techniques that actually had resulted, I believe, in false confessions. And at the time, they were under pressure themselves. The public demanded these cases were solved. They were in the public domain. So I did the report and I testified in court, and these people, the people who were convicted of the murders, these 5 people connected to the murders, were all acquitted. And next slide, please. So they're all found innocent in Guðmundur and Geirfinnur cases, 44 years. He went to the Icelandic Supreme Court, and I was present. And the court had no choice but to acquit these individuals. And this is a picture of the lawyers, 5 lawyers. And then you can see the next slide, please. You can see a picture of me in police uniform. I was young then, so that was over 40 years ago, 44 years ago, 45 years ago. And you can see a picture of me next to Karl Sutz, who was from the federal police in Germany, who had been brought in by the Icelandic government to help solve these cases. And I was in contact with him because I was there when he was there. And we were on the same murder case in another case. But actually, he got terribly angry with me because in Christmas time, 1976, I was in Iceland on a Christmas vacation, and Karl Sutz was away in Germany. And a judge in the case asked me if I could give a lie detector test, because I was now a psychology student, to one of the persons called Gudjonsson. And I gave the test to him, and unknown to me, when Karl Sutz returned, he was furious because Gudjonsson now wanted to retract the confession, because after the lie detector test, he said, maybe I didn't do this. Maybe I didn't kill Geirfinnur. You know, the police have persuaded me I've done it, but maybe I didn't do it, and maybe I should have a lawyer. Karl Sutz was furious, wrote a letter to the head judge in Iceland and to the minister, copied to the Ministry of the Interior at the time, basically saying that I jeopardized the investigation. It wasn't pretty. So, and you can see on the next slide, my battle with, the cattle of Karl Sutz, his battle with me in 1977 in January.
Gisli,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Gisli. We'll probably have to wrap up fairly quickly to give time for questions.
Yeah. This is just basically, people can read this themselves, but basically people can read the slide and see what actually had happened and how I jeopardized the investigation at the time. What I didn't realize at the time, I'd come very close to the truth, and I knew nothing about this till 2012. And now moving to the slide of a vulnerable woman, because I think this is terribly important, called Vulnerable Woman. Yeah,
it
won't take long. This is a woman who actually was left and is still left with perjury convictions because Erla implicated the others being manipulated by the police. And the police, she was never charged with murders, but she was charged with perjury. And the police have resisted in acquitting her of the perjury charges, even though all the men have been acquitted of the murders. And she's still fighting her case. And she was a woman who had a young infant child and was separated from her child and put in solitary confinement. And you can see on the last slide, actually a model of the her confession. And it's terribly important that we have enduring factors. Those are quite permanent. And then acute state factors. And these are important during interrogation because they act together. So I don't want to say any more, but there's a reference list there for people to look at if they want to look at references. And I think that's good. And I'm very happy to take questions.